My wife and I did not communicate for about a week because of a quarrel over nothing, of course, and we slept apart. During the quarrel, we had lost the pleasure of married life. It was as if an emptiness had settled in our home, and every day I missed her presence more and more. After 2 weeks, to my surprise, my wife herself came to apologize. We talked about the situation and our relationship. We both realized that the fight was not worth losing each other over. Things got back to being good again. My wife and I started living together again, cherishing every moment. Unfortunately, a week later, my wife went camping for a week with her best friends and left me alone in the apartment. Everything was normal, the usual routine. I cooked, took out the trash, went for walks, watched TV, and so on, but I felt a little lonely without her. During this time, I also noticed that new neighbors had moved in downstairs. At least something good was happening to change the monotony. The new neighbors turned out to be pretty quiet. I hadn't even seen anyone in 2 days. Well, it's none of my business, I thought, and didn't pay much attention to it. After all, everyone has their own life. After a day of wondering who my neighbors were, I started noticing an attractive girl on the street, in the entryway, at the nearest store, and so on. It turned out that this girl was a new neighbor, and she was always so quiet. Apparently, she lived alone. I got curious, and it was hard not to notice her. There was a special aura emanating from her that caught my attention. One day, when I went out to smoke on the common balcony, my neighbor also went out there. This was my chance to get to know her better. "Hello. You've just moved in. How's it going?" our neighbor asked. "Fine in principle, but my grandmother from my floor won't even let me smoke on the shared balcony," I said, trying to make light conversation. "Well, Mrs. Johnson is the same way. Let's get acquainted. My name is Jake. I live upstairs." "I'm Emily," she said with a slight smile. "That's a beautiful name. Nice to meet you. Likewise, Jake. Well, I'm going to go now. I'll see you later." I watched Emily finish her cigarette and thought about what a sweet, beautiful, and kind girl she was. There was a tenderness about her that I couldn't help but notice. But I immediately put those thoughts out of my mind because I had a wife I loved, and those thoughts had to go. I went back into the house and fell asleep, trying to focus on life with my wife. The next day, when I got home from work, Emily and I crossed paths again. She was wearing a miniskirt and a tank top. It was a hot summer outside, so she was dressed lightly and looked very attractive. I tried not to think about it and went about my business. Later that evening, as I was sitting in the kitchen, there was a knock on the door. I opened it and saw Emily in her homemade clothes, looking a little upset. "Is something wrong?" I asked. "Hey, Jake, can you give me a hand? I can't put my closet together." "Sure, I'll help you. Come on." With a smile, Emily led me to her apartment as I waited for help. Once inside her apartment, I took off my shoes and walked into a room where a box of closet space stood. I figured she lived alone, had no one to help her, and that's why it was so quiet. The room was neat, but it was clear she needed help lifting weights. Emily said, "You see what's going on? I'm going to go take a shower." She left, and I started unpacking the closet and reading the instructions. The instructions were a little confusing, but I managed to make sense of them. After a few minutes, Emily came out in her robe with wet hair and walked over to me, gently touching my shoulder. "Take a little breather. The closet isn't going anywhere," she said. Something strange was happening, her frequent breathing, the slight shivering, and the blush on her cheeks. Emily, smiling, stepped closer and gave me a heated kiss. And I didn't even mind. At that moment, all the boundaries I'd set for myself seemed to dissolve. Emily seemed the most beautiful and goddess-like thing I'd ever seen. There was nothing but her in my thoughts. Her touch was electrifying, and I felt drawn to her in a way I couldn't resist. When we reached the kitchen, I placed her on the table, and in that moment nothing mattered but her. We sat in silence for a while after that, realizing the reality of what had just happened. Emily looked at me with a tender expression on her face, and I felt a mixture of emotions, guilt, excitement, and confusion. I knew I had crossed a line I shouldn't have crossed, but in that moment, it seemed impossible to resist her. There was an undeniable attraction to her, and I was captivated. I walked back to my apartment, conflicting thoughts swarming in my head. I tried to focus on the TV, but my thoughts kept returning to Emily, her smile, her touch, the way she looked at me. It was like she'd put a spell on me, and I didn't know how to break it. I knew I would have to face my wife when she returned, and I wasn't sure how I was going to deal with everything that had happened.